Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. It was a good chance to reflect on some of the work that we've been doing at Cambridge University Library over the past 2 years, but also before that, reflecting on how we engage with the public, whoever they may be, and how we work with them and how we use the collections that we hold to kind of speak to them, if that makes sense. One of the things that I'm going to do is talk about very abstract things, and I'm going to construct a number of straw men, as it were, to argue against where we need to go. And I realize that there are lots of really great examples which prove what I'm about to say are already happening across research and academic libraries. But I would suggest, and maybe they can come up in the Q&A, I'd be interested to know what other people would be working on. But I also argue that they are perhaps sporadic, certainly within the university library where I work. They are quite sporadic and ad hoc, as it were. So I realize that I'm going to talk in quite kind of big terms, and there is work in this area. But just to kind of be, I am aware of that. So I've been working at Cambridge University Library now for about, I think it's 5 years today, actually, which is remarkable. And I came from a museum background. And one of the things that compelled me to the University Library was that I was keen to produce public programs based on academic research. And I also wanted to work with a collection of international importance. They're really the two reasons why I left the museum world to work in public engagement for a university library. And as soon as I arrived at Cambridge University Library, one thing struck me, which I'd not really considered before, and something that's very relevant to libraries, much more so than I think than to museums, where I'd previously worked. And that's the difference in the way in which readers and visitors experienced the collections that we hold. So if we just think about this, so here is a picture. For people who come to exhibitions at Cambridge University Library, you get, I don't know if you've been to Cambridge University Library, I don't know if you've been to the exhibition space, the Millstone exhibition space at Cambridge University Library. What you have is a very low ceiling. Obviously, all manuscript collections, when they go on display, have to be kept at very low light levels. And you have to look at them through glass. Readers, however, and on the right-hand side, we've got a very blurry picture. It's the best one I could find when I wasn't connected to the university's VPN, is readers in our reading rooms. I think here we have the manuscripts reading room, or in the rare books reading room. They get natural light. They can sit down. And they also have a sense which is denied to exhibition visitors, which is that they can touch the manuscripts. And often these are the same manuscripts. So when we present them to exhibition visitors, they get them in a certain way on the left-hand side, viewed through a case as a kind of heritage object. And when we show them to, when the researchers call them up, you get this very different experience. And I think we can go further as well. When an exhibition visitor comes to look at an exhibition, they're told what to take from the item. The exhibition experience is one of transmission, the curator passing knowledge from themselves to the viewer, and the reader in the reading room has a completely different experience because they'll come with their own knowledge. The manuscript is a device to build upon their own knowledge, and then they use the manuscript for their own devices. So it could go, it's written with a monograph, books, papers, that kind of thing. If we're lucky, the exhibition visitor might go home and look at some of the same type of material, perhaps on a digital library. They might be stimulated to read further on the subject, or simply to tell their friends who might also come too. Arguably, we can suggest that the researcher has something value added to the whole experience. anyone who's been in an academic library, which presumably we all have, perhaps they've done their own academic research. It's not just about reading and thinking about manuscripts, and trips to great research libraries are not just about research. It's the interaction with people, perhaps planned, perhaps not. And it's the act of discussion as much as is part of the research process itself. So just as the exhibition visitor is denied the option of examining the manuscript in optimum conditions, so too they excluded, I think, from that general discussion about the work. They don't get to take part in that. So here is a picture of the Cambridge University Library tea room, RIP at the moment because it's not open. But one of the interesting things about Cambridge, which differs from the Bodleian, for instance, and the British Library, is that if you're an exhibition visitor, you don't get to go to the tea room. You can't get a cup of coffee, which is, as we all know, a basic right of visiting an exhibition. If you go to an exhibition, it's the human right to have a coffee as well. This is denied to you in Cambridge. Now, we're trying to fix that. But one of the interesting things about the Cambridge University Library tea room, and one of the reasons why I like it so much, is when you go in there, it's not just people having a cup of tea. They're talking with people they've just met about their research. Perhaps they're talking about the things they've just read. They're having PhD supervisions. Sometimes you get, a chemist talking to a physicist, and that's where Nobel Prizes come from. And all these things are happening in the university library tea room. And one of the things that I really like about the British Library Cafe, which I know a lot of people complain about, is the same things are happening. When you go and have a coffee, you can hear this kind of hubbub, this discussion about the research, about things that people are working on. And I think the research libraries are as much about the people, about those conversations, as about they are the stuff. That's key to them. And one of the things I'm really interested in terms of how we work with visitors, to exhibitions or to events, is how do we bring them into that conversation? And I think we tend to think that public engagement within research libraries begins and ends with access to the manuscript. But really, I think that people are more interested in access to the knowledge. That is key to the visitor experience. That's why people go to these great research libraries to look at stuff. It's as much about access to the knowledge and access to the ideas. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how we push that further. So one of the things that happens when planning exhibitions, and one of the things that I really enjoy, is that we get the items out. And I think this is one of the things that I miss the most about the pandemic, not being able to talk to the curators about the things. So this is a 12th century Lotus Sutra, which is going in our next exhibition, which opens in January and is on samurai, using our Japanese collection, and is curated by Kristin Williams, our keeper of our Japanese collections. And this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Quite simply, this is the most amazing object I've ever seen. Incredibly deep indigo color, written on in gold calligraphy. And to talk to Kristin about this item is just wonderful. To be in the same space as this item is just wonderful. And I'm devastated that the people who come to the exhibition, understandably, it has to be in a case, they don't get that experience of just being with the thing, not separated by glass. It is completely remarkable. And it's not just the Japanese collections. We're working on an exhibition on Darwin, which opens in July next year. Cambridge University Library has the Darwin Correspondence Project. It has 10 of the world's Darwin experts in the building. They're working on the exhibition and, spend hours talking to the curators about what we're going to do in the show, about how we translate the manuscripts that we hold. I've had many enjoyable afternoons with our head of the Geniza Research Unit and keeper of rare books, working on our current exhibition, which is called Ghost Words, exploring the transition of religious texts across physical space, with the items in front of us, with ancient Bibles and Qurans in front of us, having those discussions. That's one of the best things about my job. And that's something is completely, how do we make that experience? How do we provide that experience for people who come to visit exhibitions? It's a great joy, but it's one denied to the casual exhibition visitor. And I think the difference that I've articulated, the way we approach readers and visitors, is subtle but important. undoubtedly, there's been a great shift in the nature of public access over the past 3 decades. The opening of the British Library campus in Euston 23 years ago, the redevelopment of Manchester's John Rylands Library, and more recently, the opening of the Western Library in the Bodleian in Oxford, turn these organisations towards the public. And you see the same with our own exhibition space as well, though much smaller. The Milstein exhibition space, I think, is about 20 years old now. There's a turn towards the public. However, when we make this turn towards the public, rather than providing an information service, which is what we provide to academics and librarians, we provide a heritage model, as it were. It's replicated from museums. It's not a library service. It's a museum or a heritage service, I would argue. And libraries have not said to the non-research public, we're here for the knowledge you need. This is research libraries. They don't usually say that, I don't think. They say, here is curated, controlled access to the knowledge which we think you might be interested. That's how exhibitions and public programs work in our great research libraries. And I think the question to this is, does that really matter? Well, I think so, because knowledge is at the heart of the world and lots of people seek to control it. So I think if we can open it up as much as possible, then the world will be a better place. And I think if the academy is to remain relevant, then libraries are the kind of central to that work. And it's not just about making individual manuscripts relevant, but there's something else. There's a thing about making research relevant. There's a thing about making knowledge relevant, and how the public engagement teams who work in these libraries can work with the specialists who work in the libraries and the knowledge that they hold. And I think the pandemic has opened up new ways of doing this. It's shown us ways of moving beyond that transactional novel of here is a great manuscript. This is what you should think about it. So one thing that's happened is that most events have moved online. And I know we've all got Zoom fatigue, but it is really interesting what that means. So initially, everything moved online, and now most institutions, from what I can tell, have moved to a hybrid model. So on the left-hand side here, we've just had the Sanders lectures at Cambridge University Library, delivered by Orietta de Rold, who's an academic at St. John's in Cambridge, and she was talking on paper past and paper future. And in terms of the in-person attendance to that lecture, it was probably one of the lowest ones due to the fact that there was social distancing. Understandably, not everyone's ready to kind of go to lectures. But in terms of the live attendance, it was the most successful Sanders ever, with over, I can't remember the full numbers, but over the 3 days, way, way above the number we would normally get in the room at the same time, at the time of the lecture. Now, what we've done over the past few years anyway is record the Sanders and release them via our YouTube channel, which does mean that more people see them, but they don't get to experience that live instance of the lecture, which they did this year and which they will now forevermore. We'll never move back to a non-hybrid event. And indeed, we were having the conversations in our teams at the moment, and the way we're thinking about it, if we can't do both, we'd rather do online than just in person, because it's about the audience. We can reach the audience much more successfully. We can find an audience. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the way that Zoom and other platforms allow the audience to interact with the speaker, to interact with the knowledge. Now, the other thing that the pandemic has allowed us to do, has pushed us to do, is to experiment more. So this picture here is from an event that we hold every year called the Liberation Lecture. And that is a lecture which explores the nature of publishing in France during the period of occupation. Now, that lecture has always been delivered in English in Cambridge. And for the first year ever, it was delivered in French by an academic who was based in Sciences Po. So that was live streamed in French with English subtitles. Now, I have to say, there were issues with that. It was incredibly difficult to set up. And there were some issues with the live translation. The translator that we picked perhaps wasn't used to academic French. And there were some issues with the translation, with the live translation. But it was a really interesting experiment. And it's definitely something that we would try again. And it enables us to think in a completely different way about who the audience might be. So that lecture was timed, so it met with an East Coast American audience could attend the lecture live, which is not something we would ever have thought about before. But it's thinking about where is the audience, how do we reach them, how do we speak to that audience? And I think outside of London, it can be very difficult to find an audience. Especially when the audience can be very specific. But the pandemic has made us re-examine what technology is available and how we might reach them. So again, reaching that audience, this is our current exhibition, which is called Ghost Words, which I think closes on Friday. So you'll have to be incredibly quick if you want to go and see it. However, you can visit online. So this is something that we did experiment within before the pandemic. This is a virtual walkthrough of the exhibition. It was curated by Dr. Ben Outhwaite, who's the head of the Geniza Research Unit at Cambridge University Library, and it explores palimpsests. Now, palimpsests are really interesting. It's not even a word that I understood before I started at Cambridge University Library. I don't think I'd ever heard it before. And then suddenly we had to work on an exhibition about it. But they are fascinating. Now, I would argue that although palimpsests are really interesting, perhaps it is a slightly niche subject. However, with new technology, that doesn't really matter because you will definitely find the audience. So this is the online walkthrough where people can look at all the manuscripts. And with this particular one of the exciting things we're able to do is, so if you go and try it, when you look at each manuscript as you walk around the gallery, it gives you a link and you can click through to the digital library and then see the whole of that manuscript if it's been digitized. I think all of the manuscripts in this particular exhibition had been digitized. So it just shows you, and we had done this, we had experimented with this before the pandemic, but we were able to build on that learning and do something much more advanced for this particular exhibition. And this idea of finding audience was something that we'd been thinking about before the pandemic. So just as with Ghost Words, we'd experimented with doing walkthroughs before, we were able to build on that. And that's something that happened with this exhibition as well. So this was an exhibition called Black Cantabs, which ran along the main corridor in Cambridge University Library. Now, it was curated by students, for students, and covered the history of Black students at Cambridge. It was curated by a group called the Black Cantabs, the president of which is here, Suraya Mohammed, stood next to Jessica Gardner, who's the Cambridge University librarian. And one of the things when I talk about audiences, I'm not talking about big numbers. We're not that interested in numbers. It's not just about, oh, this exhibition reached this many people. What we want to say at the start is, who is this exhibition for? And can we reach them? And that's one of the things that's really helped during the pandemic. So this exhibition was by students, for students. And the feedback we got was that it made them feel more connected to the library as a building because they could see themselves in it. And that was really interesting learning as we moved forward during the pandemic, because we started to bring that learning into the work we were doing. So these are three of the events that we've run, which were, as it were, born digital. So on the left-hand side is a thing called the Really Popular Book Group. And we came up with the idea during the pandemic. And it was a challenge from the university librarian, Jess Gardner, to say, how do we make the university library about books? We want people to talk about books, but when we talk about Cambridge University Library, we often talk about things like Isaac Newton, or we talk about Charles Darwin, we talk about medieval manuscripts, but it's full of books. How do we get people talking about books? So the way that one of the things we did was we organized this thing called the Really Popular Book Group, which is a book group about really popular books that people have read. Now, we started off with Philip Pullman's Northern Lights, and then we actually did Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, expecting that everyone would hate it, That's not what the case was. Lots of people loved it. You can see why it sold so many copies. And basically, we have either I or my colleague Laura Greenfield, and we bring in someone to talk about that particular book who can talk around it. So it might be a Cambridge academic who's got an interest in it. It might be another author. But what it showed us was that the audience for this thing was not just Cambridge based. And one of the problems we have with Cambridge University Library is that people are scared of the building. They don't want to come in the building. They find it intimidating. This is completely eliminated by having it digital. There's no need to be scared of the building. We've also got 2 other instances here. So this is an ongoing series. We're in the middle of these 2. The bottom one has already happened. The top one is going to happen in the next couple of weeks on writing disability. And one of the questions we'd had was, why don't you do more about disabled writing? And so this is what we looked at. So we had 2, a short story writer and someone who writes for television, talk about writing about disability and how that's reflected in the written word. And again, these things just found their audience by judicious kind of marketing, talking to the right people, getting them to tweet it. And this is not something that we would consider doing, probably, I don't think we might have done, but we wouldn't have considered doing it in person in the library. But we did do it. It's been really successful. And a lot of people who came to this are still self-isolating. They're still self-isolating, but it gives them an output. It found that audience. And the other thing that I wanted to say about these 3 events, about why I'm really interested in platforms like Zoom, and that is because of the chat function. The chat function is revolutionary in the way that we engage people with the collections, because they don't have to wait to ask a question. They don't have to be intimidated to ask a question. They can just make a point. And the other exciting thing about it, I know when we go to academic questions, and an academic always stands and says, this is less of a question, it's more of a point, and everyone goes, ooh. But however, it's really interesting because as a museum person, as someone who works in exhibitions, the thing you always want to know is, what do people think about this? What do they understand about this object? What are they taking away from this exhibition? Well, the chat function allows that, but it allows them to participate in the conversation. It's not just a transmission of knowledge. You can see the kind of the chat happening live, as it were. So that's really
Can I give you the 5-minute warning?
Yeah, that's okay. Coming to the end. And so finally, if we take this further, so how do we expand on this? So this is, the left-hand side is a tour of our current exhibition. We're still doing in-person tours of our current exhibition, very limited, socially distanced tours. And tours are interesting because they allow people to discuss with the curator about the items. And again, but it's quite small numbers. On the right-hand side, we have Ben Outhwaite, who's the head of the Geneza Research Unit at Cambridge University Library. And here he is during a live stream, a preview of that exhibition, Ghost Words, describing and explaining in the first instance Oregon's hexapler, which is part of the Geneza. But during the live stream, which I think about 300 people came to, they could ask questions of Ben, of the thing. So the conversation that I was having with Ben about hexapler, about the Geneza, members of the public could have that same conversation. They could have that interaction. And that would have been impossible without things like Zoom, without things like Facebook Live. And I think that's what's really exciting. It provides really interesting access to subject specialists like Ben, but not just subject specialists like Ben, also the collection, these 2 things coming together. And I think that's where the most interesting things lie in the future. So just to conclude, here is our next exhibition. I'll just give it a slight plug here, which opens on the 22nd of January. As I said, the growth in public engagement in academic and research libraries has brought new expertise into libraries and new audiences for special collections. But is there scope for public engagement specialists to work with information specialists to create opportunities and systems to turn the information for a more general public? How do we make more instances where Ben gets to talk to people like that? And I think there are examples of this, but one of the things that we're thinking about at the moment is, what does the equivalent of the British Library Business and IP Centre look like if it were expanded for a larger remit? You know, it could work with charities or community groups to help use the information we hold. And I think with the great leap in information technology, this doesn't have to be with groups locally or in the UK. is there a way of expanding the public engagement offer to something that encompasses information, expertise, and not just heritage? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for that fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. We've got 5 minutes for questions. So, Eleanor, have we got any questions for Christopher?
We don't seem to.
Oh.
No questions in the Q&A, and in the chat, it doesn't look like any actual questions, I'm afraid.
Chris, can you remind us how to do Q&As? Ed is asking.
Yes, so if you go into the panel at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there is an icon called Q&A, and the way of receiving them is for the attendees to write questions into that part of Zoom, and panelists and committee members can then answer either on their microphones or by typing questions. That's how it works.
If there's no questions, perhaps may I take the opportunity to say something? I was interested in your talk, Christopher, because many years ago I started my career in the Taylor Schechter Geniza Research Unit, so I remember it before the technology stage. So it's actually fascinating to see how all these fragments are now being used. But actually, the things you were talking about putting on an exhibition, I mean, the whole budgeting now of what you budget for is going to change. It's not just going to be now for cases, for mounts. It's now a completely different budget sheet.
That is true. We had started budgeting more for digital anyway. I think our biggest expense in terms of digitization was getting things photographed that weren't already photographed for the library's the digital library. I think one of the most exciting things, though, that's coming out of our understanding of digital is just how many free tools there are to use. I mean, we do pay for a bigger Zoom license, but it's not astronomical. It's a lot cheaper than a display case, that's for certain. And I think one of the most interesting things is the fact that there are these kind of free tools available. And I mean, I think we did I think this is right. We did the live stream of of Ben talking about the hexapla using an iPhone. You know, it just on a gimbal. So I just think it is remarkable just how many, how kind of, once you know how to access the material, just how kind of reasonable it is. And it's a lot cheaper than putting on exhibitions, that's for certain. Yeah.
And the walkthrough that you did for Ghosts.
Yeah.
Is that just for the length of the exhibition, or is that permanently available?
That is so that was a bit more expensive. We had to bring in a separate company in order to produce it, who are Cambridge based. And I think if you were thinking about doing one, I think probably we'd budget somewhere between £3,000 and £5,000 per exhibition, which in exhibition terms isn't very much, really.
But that will be available. I mean, it won't just be for the life of the exhibition.
No, it'll be there for longer. It's hosted by the company that we paid for it. So we just need to work out how long they'll make it available, or if not, can we have it so we can make it? But that bit is TBC, because it's quite experimental, and we've not quite worked out how to put it on it has to go on a separate platform. And how we do that, we've not worked out yet, but it will be available for a while yet. While we work it, hopefully forever. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions that have come in, Eleanor?
The question on the tea room is the fact that Cambridge University Library's tea room, if you've never been, is behind where readers access the library. So the exhibition space is in a public area, which in the University Library, Cambridge University Library, isn't very big, and the tea room is behind where readers go in order to access the library. There have been instances where we've let people through. So we did an exhibition called The Rising Tide, Women at Cambridge, where people could go through and get a cup of tea. And we are looking at ways about how in the future, readers, exhibition visitors can access the tea room, which is famous for its cheese scones, if you didn't know that. Or it was when we produced cheese scones.
I've noticed that if we run to schedule now, that if there's no more questions, which I don't, Ellen, I don't think there are any. In that,
No, there are not.
No, in that case, Christopher, can I thank you very, very much indeed for your presentation.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, and thank you. In that case, then I think we have just a 10